So, firstly, we're going to begin with research ethics. And there are different ways of looking at research ethics, right? There are kind of the ethical considerations that you should make as an organization, a charitable organization that's working with young people. And then you've got the research ethics that kind of take place more at universities and academic institutions. The base set is the kind of the same, right? It's a way of behaving to protect people from harm. So, not just the participant, but also the researcher. The thing that I want to stress, though, is ethics is not really a list of rules, right? You might have an ethical checklist or guidance. You might do an ethical committee where you do a submission for ethical approval, but there is no clear kind of you have to do this, have to do that, have to do that. It's very different to say GDPR. And you'll see this if you go to different universities will have different ethical procedures, different ethical committees. Every academic will tell you how difficult and how annoying it all is. But some are easier than others. It doesn't mean necessarily that the some are more lax about their ethics. It's just, it's not a set of rules. Some people are more maximalist in how they do it. Some people are more minimalist. But the core principle is the same, right? It's it's making sure that you understand what the ethics are within a research context. Make sure that young people understand what ethical behavior looks like, right? And it's not just don't lie. It's about all of those additional considerations about power, dynamics, and relationships. And this is particularly important within peer research because those peer researchers, if it's working really well, they have those personal relationships with the people they are researching. They are from those communities, they are their peers, they might know them in some personal capacity. And that is a real strength in terms of the research integrity. You get trust, confidence, all the stuff that we've talked about before about why peer research is effective. But it does create responsibility as well. It makes it a double-edged sword, right? Because there's that closeness of relationship, it can be more challenging to manage the ethical side of it. So we always talk about do no harm principles. We kind of bring it into four kind of categories to make it very simple, right? There's the really simple one around harm to participants, the people you're researching, doing surveys with, interviews with. This is particularly tricky if you're looking at a more sensitive subject like mental health, insecure housing, homelessness, and things like that, where people may be asked about their difficult experiences. And it's making sure that peer researchers understand how to reduce that re-traumatization, that harm, but then also having additional support and signposting. The second one is the harm to the researcher, right? If you have young people with the lived experience of the issue that they're researching, it also applies to them, right? Hearing someone talk about their experience, for example, insecure housing, when they've experienced it 2 years ago, or whatever, may bring back distressing memories. So it's about also having that support system for the researcher, for those peer researchers, and having a system of debrief and name support. Third one, which is sometimes often overlooked, but actually is really important with young people, is harm to community. And this is this idea where we always say, you take an asset-based approach with your research. If you constantly publish findings about a community that talk about knife crime or poverty or unemployment or whatever it is, that is a reality that you might have found out through your data, but it's always one part of the picture. So it's about how do you make sure that whatever the work that you're doing, whatever the research finds out, that you're not stigmatizing a community, you're not stigmatizing young people, and what the impact of that work will be on the people more widely. And the last one is extractive research, right? And this is partly the harm to the participants, but it's more about the way in which you go about the research. It's about that feedback loop, right? It's not just a good practice to ensure that young people are informed of how their voice has made a difference, but it's also kind of a harming, unethical way of working, right? So making sure that you collect the stories and data and then you give nothing back. We always say you have to remunerate participants and researchers, but it's more than that. It's more the systemic impact that work has actually made, right? How are you showing them the change that has been made as a result of them taking part? So power dynamics and peer research are particularly important, right? So firstly, you see the pressure to participate. You might have one peer researcher who has really good soft skills, really good talker, really extroverted, and they're going to go, right, I'm going to get 6 interviews in my school, right? And how do you make sure that that peer researcher, who is very enthusiastic, and that's fantastic, but isn't pressuring someone to take part, right? Making sure that they understand that it's completely voluntary and your friends don't have an obligation to do it. The people in your life don't have an obligation to do it, and to make sure that it doesn't affect their relationship with them if they say no. The second one, we call it the clipboard effect, but that's kind of a misnomer now because very rarely do peer researchers have clipboards. But it's this idea that as soon as they are in the role of a researcher, they are asking questions. It's that thing where, like, I'm not here to answer your questions, you're here to answer my questions. It shifts the power dynamic ever so slightly. So even though they are peers, it is the questioner and the questioned, right? So understanding how it feels to be questioned, doing exercises with young people where you do ask them 6 or 7 questions, and then you see them squirm a little bit, feel a bit anxious, getting them to sit in that feeling and understand what it might be like. So they're aware of it and they can name that shift, and they can be aware when they're doing it, how to manage it. Third one is organizational power. And this is a huge one within research ethics. I mean, it's particularly conscious. I mean, the typical example is, you do a piece of research that says smoking doesn't kill, and it's funded by the tobacco industry. That's like the old school example. But there are kind of nuanced ways of it, right? You're being funded by a local authority to do a piece of research. How reluctant are you for the research to be incredibly critical of the local authority, right? You might really want to speak truth to power, you might be really radical, but there might be people, either yourself or within your organization, that want to maintain that relationship, right? In terms of getting future work or funding or whatever it is. So I think peer researchers need to be recognized to understand this. I think transparency about funding, you're doing this research, it's not funded from core, it's funded by this, they're doing it for this purpose. What is your purpose with this? What do you want to achieve out of this? This is what they want to achieve out of it. And you think about how you navigate those power dynamics, right? The last thing I'll say is that Catch-22 Birmingham's got a really great one where they had a peer research project, trained young people, and they specifically got young people to challenge those adult stakeholders, who try to generally reframe findings to look at organizational priorities. But again, we'll send all links in the chat. Anonymity versus confidentiality, and this is before we even talk about consent. And this is one of the key things that we teach young people. What's the difference of it? Having a clear understanding about what the difference is. I don't think most young people do have a clear understanding. Anonymity is very, very simple about keeping that data safe and making sure that they cannot be identified, right? So identifying information, pseudonyms, password protection, all of that. But what's really clear is young people may understand anonymity as name, age, date of birth, right? But actually, it's about giving some clear worked examples of where anonymity can be a little bit more nuanced. So, for example, we always say, is someone's ethnicity an identifying piece of information? If you're looking at London and you go, well, they're half Chinese, half English, using myself for example, does that give them, is that an identifying piece of information? On a London scale, it is no. In a youth club where there might be 40 young people and there's only one person who's half Chinese, half English, that is identifying information. So anonymity and what is classed as an identifying detail really depends on the sample size that you're looking at, right? Confidentiality is a little bit different, right? You basically agree that you're going to keep what is said private, but obviously there are safeguarding considerations, right? So it's about worried about their safety and things like that. Confidentiality and anonymity can be negotiated with the person that you're doing the research with, but then it changes the consent structure and it changes the research ethical considerations, right? And how you get ethical approval. So, for example, if you're doing peer research and they're talking to young people, that will be anonymous, that will be confidential within its safeguarding limits. If you've got peer researchers interviewing, for example, local authority commissioners, and you want the local authority commissioners to be named in the piece of research, as Lewisham Commissioner, blah, 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 that requires a different consent process, but you can do that, right? But you have to make sure that the participants are comfortable and agree to do that ahead of time. So one activity we do is traffic lights, and we love traffic lights. I think I've got like at least 2 traffic lights activities in here. And it's about basically green, amber, and red, and getting young people to understand and identify what is more comfortable to talk about, what might need a little bit of break or reflection, and then what specifically they need to step out and speak to a staff member about. So we give them the 3 colored cards, or we get them to kind of shout green, red, or amber, and we read out a range of research topics, right? And we get them to think about how comfortable they are talking about those research topics. So there's family relationships, mental health, school, housing. You've got the broad topics as well. But depending on what you're researching, you can go a little bit more granular. So, for example, we did this and it was looking at mental health. And one young person had the suggestion of like antidepressants, right? If they openly discuss antidepressants, where does that sit? Is that a red? No, we need to step out. I'm not going to discuss your prescriptions with you. Is it we might need to think about it or set some boundaries? Or we're looking at mental health. We're looking at antidepressants and prescription medication. This is clearly a part of the research topic. I've covered it in the information guide. I feel comfortable doing it and discuss openly, right? And again, it's not a hard rule. It's about where you and your organization and the scope of your research feel comfortable. It's about who your participants are. It's very different talking to a 16-year-old versus 23-year-old. And it depends on, what the research is, right? And how they've been informed about what it's about. 8 ethical considerations. I'll be quite quick. We teach this to young people as well. What are all the different ethical considerations? We give them the words and we get them to think about what it looks like in practice and what it looks like if people violate those things. Sorry, I just saw Kelsey. You just said, does confidentiality change if you're surveying adults? No, it doesn't change. You still have a responsibility to report something if that worries you. I don't think anything necessarily changes with anonymity and confidentiality. I actually don't think it changes with adults, particularly between like 16 to 25. The only difference is 16 and under, then it gets really, really messy. I think adults largely, 18 onwards are treated the same as someone who's 40 or 45. 8 ethical concerns in peer research. So, for example, language, people understand this is like don't swear and don't think, but it's also about accessibility. So it's jargon language, stigmatizing language, clinical language when not needed as well, not just in how peer researchers talk, but also in the information that they're providing, in the consent that they're providing, and in the way that they write it up. Recruitment is about how you recruit those peer researchers and those participants. Equity of access, making sure that everyone has access to the research, but also who can access it and take part in it as well. Consent, we'll talk about that. We've got a section about how to do consent. Harm to participants, we'll talk about that. Safeguarding and researcher. Research participant relationship is a kind of broad catch-all, and we talk about power dynamics. There's also some basic stuff which actually does come up more than you think, right? Where it's like, don't ask for the participant's number. Don't use it as like a Hinge, Tinder dating moment, right? They are young 17-year-olds interviewing each other, asking questions and getting to know each other. It does come up. So it's about making sure that they understand what a professional relationship between a researcher and participant, especially if you're engaging them for research purpose. So language, I'll just talk about really clearly. Firstly, just use asset-based approaches, not kind of just going leading questions and language that problematizes young people. We do a jargon busting activity. So we look at all these different asset-based language. I think it's really interesting, especially to bring in a lot of the language that's being used by practitioners or commissioners or funders, right? So if they're looking at a specific topic, you go, these are all the terms that if you're in a meeting with commissioners or funders, this is how they describe it. Here's the different systems that are in place and how they would explain them to kind of get them to understand all of that, right? Like, what does neat mean? Why do we say provision? Like all of those barriers to participation. What do we actually mean by that, right? And how do they translate it as well into language that they can use and communicate with their peers that still gets at the heart of, say, neat provision without having to use that language? Second one is recruitment. So, we talk about this before in recruitment. This is a really important thing about stacking the deck when you're choosing your peer researchers. If you get 5 young people who have really positive experience of CAMs, I don't know where you got them, but let's say you find 5. That is already stacking the deck because you're recruiting peer researchers with a positive experience of the thing that you're researching, but then it cascades as well, especially if they're responsible for looking for young people. So they will talk to their friends. Their friends are just probability basis, more likely to have a positive experience of mental health. And then therefore the entire research project kind of just gets shifted and biased, right? And it's not just a consideration for the quality of your research, but it's also an ethical concern. right? Because you are misrepresenting a challenge with a bad sample. But there's also the other side of it, right? If you're looking at re-traumatization, if you don't have the support or capacity to support that, it's about recruiting vulnerable participants to sensitive topics. So, for example, we did a piece of research about interventions in A&Es in Northwest London. It's about this idea of having a youth worker in A&E for young people who were suspected of having faced some sort of youth violence and how they do that intervention there. Huge challenge ethically, right? And it had to have huge amounts of support capacity behind it because you're dealing with a young person who has come into A&E with an injury that is suspected as youth violence. They're in a very, very vulnerable moment. So to have a young person also come up to them and interview them, being like, "Hey, is this about youth violence?" About really, really challenging. So you had to have huge amounts of safeguarding risks and support structures in place to do that. Third one, equity of access, and it's more thinking about all the different barriers, identifying those barriers for different groups and communities, and then thinking about how you address it. So for some, it might be transport, always very expensive depending on where you are. We've done work where it's in more rural communities. How do you get young people getting to the place where you're doing that research, especially? Technology as well. Not everyone has smartphones or phones. If you're doing online interviews, they might come on their phone and the microphone's not very good and it might be difficult for them to hear. How do you navigate that? Time, there's a simple thing. Don't do it during exam seasons and stuff like that, but just be conscious of that. Language as well. There was a piece of research that was taking place in Tower Hamlets. They had to have more than just English because they were looking at over 50s, over 60s, so they had to have it available in a broad range of languages for those communities. And then disability, so easy reads and accessible alternatives, and then online tools for that. Ethical consent and agreement. So I'm actually not going to talk too much about this because we've got the whole thing afterwards, but it's about not rushing it and I'll repeat this again, but it's about consent being ongoing as well. I think obviously sometimes it is literally just a signature on a thing and then it's a one inflection point where they do it, but it's actually an ongoing thing, right? You need to continually ask for consent. You have withdrawal periods as well, and making sure that the participant fully understands it. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges with peer research, right? A lot of peer researchers are given the consent form, they might send out the information sheet, but how are we checking qualitatively that actually that consent is understood? I mean, the first step is making sure that all the peer researchers can basically cite the consent stuff without looking at a piece of paper. They really, truly have memorized it and understand it, but also making sure that they take the time to talk through it with the person they're interviewing as well. Hunt participants. So this is the main one, and it can be multifaceted. There's stuff around remunerations, making sure that they're paid for their time, that it's not furthering economic inequality by them taking part, having clear signposting for whatever the topic is to make sure that they have services and support for them if anything comes up. There's sensitivity screenings where you can discuss it with your safeguarding lead, which is like which topics or maybe which groups that we're engaging with do need additional care even before we engage them. There's the stuff around re-traumatization. There's also some basic stuff as well. We had an example of a peer research project that took place in South London and young people going out and doing street interviews. And one of the young people just got bitten, like fully just not even by a dog or like a person just bit them, right? And I don't know what that was about. No antagonism, not that it would be justifiable anyway. But if you've got young people just working in the field, it's just like unpredictable, right? So how do you make sure that you do that safely? A lot of this usually takes place in youth clubs, which are a bit more of a safe space as well. But if you are going out into the street, what are those additional considerations to protect? So we keep talking about re-traumatization. This is one of the main ones. And we basically put it down as like one project we spoke to said the level of supported need for peer researchers is quite significant because of the risk of them being re-traumatized by some of the stories they're exposed to, right? So it's this idea that challenging conversations on difficult issues bring up things from their past or things that may re-traumatize them, right? So it's about making sure that you understand that, making sure that they recognize it, and then how you kind of step back from it. I think it's quite rare. It really depends on the topic. Again, if you're looking at, just housing necessarily, or, what do you want in a greener borough or whatever, it probably won't come up as much. But where it does come up, those projects need to have significantly more resources and capacity to facilitate this safely. We have said no to doing peer research projects because the topic that they were looking at was very, very serious and there was not the funding for it, right? And I think that is a challenge in terms of making sure that funders understand that not all peer research is the same in terms of need, right? And if you are looking at these topics, you just need far, far more support. Ethical consideration, last one's harm to the researcher. We talked about re-traumatization, feeling triggered. There's also something about isolation. If they're unable to kind of talk about it, they might have these really interesting conversations, but because of privacy, they can't necessarily tell other people. And then there's burnout as well. And burnout can be a really serious one, especially if you are getting them to manage multiple roles with really tight deadlines and you don't have that space. So we always talk about structured debriefs, check-ins. We don't just do check-ins as a group. We do check-ins on one-on-ones as well for things that they don't feel comfortable talking about in a group. We also have a no blame culture. We make sure that they understand who the designated safeguarding lead is. And then we just have kind of discussion points, right? Checking in on yourselves. And we do this after, especially when you're in the fieldwork stage, it's always making sure that you have a debrief before and after the fieldwork. It's probably less important to have individual debriefs when you're doing the design phase, but specifically when you go into the fieldwork, it's really important. And then lastly, on ethics, just an ethics card. You can see I love a traffic light. But it's basically just giving them ethical scenarios, right? And getting them to think about what is ethical, concerning, but you might want to discuss, and unethical. Generally, very few of them will ever be green, where it's just pure ethical. What we want to try and do, and it's slightly unfair, right? Like in a real life scenario, there will be things that are green and there will be things that are red, right? We put in the amber because we want to make sure that young people always err on the side of caution. So a lot of those things will be amber or red. Very few will be green because just like safeguarding, the best practice for us is always saying, if you're not sure, discuss it with the supervisor. If you're not sure, discuss it with the safeguarding lead, right? We want very few scenarios, unless the ones that are fully black and white for young people to be like, nope, no action needed. Definitely, let's go on about it. So it's kind of basic stuff like a participant says, don't write that bit down mid-interview. And it's not just thinking about what counts as ethical, but it's also getting them to think about how do they manage it, right? And we're starting to go into the fieldwork training here, but how do you have those conversations, right? How do you make sure that you are aware of how to deal with it? So if a staff member suggests changing a participant's quote to sound more positive, this has happened in the past with external people, and right, we've heard examples of it happening. So it's also that thing of how do you train young people, even before they engage with external stakeholders, about what is ethical about that, what is unethical about that, and how do you manage it, right? You don't want to peer research being like, no, I'm not going to do that. That is unethical and you're acting unethically, even though that's true and objectively correct. It's about how do you manage those situations as well as not just identify them. So the last thing I'll say is we think it's really good practice. It's slight, I'm not going to say slight, it's extremely overkill. But if you want a really good step-by-step process of research ethics, universities are pretty good. So we put the University of York one. This is their humanities research centre, which is probably the most applicable for a lot of the work that people are doing with young people. There are separate different research forms. If you're doing health research, if you're doing research with patients, this one is kind of more humanities. And even still, they have different forms depending on what the research is. So vulnerable groups, sensitive topics, or deception. Deception's a valid thing in terms of, experimental stuff, or low risk research, which is probably a lot of the ones that you guys might do, and then non-anonymous ones. So it's where they're actually being named and you're speaking to people on the record, right? And each of those have a different submission form. And the submission form will take you through a series of questions that you need to answer, right? And I think it's a really good thing just to try and fill it in and see how you'd answer that. And if you find yourself not having necessarily a good answer for it, or a section is a little bit blank, it's a good reflective tool, at least to think about what you need to do a little bit more work on. Typically with the universities, they will submit this to an ethical committee and the ethical committee will scrutinize that as well. I don't know if you have the ability to do that. You might have an external partner who can do that, or find someone who is a bit of an ethics nerd, and then they can do that. But I think even just for you, just to do it yourself is a really good reflective practice. Um, and then Kelsey says, what do you think about ensuring ethics in creative methodologies? The other day we looked at photo voice, for example. Any ideas for coming up with the ethical guidelines for peer researchers? I think creative methods is probably one of the most tricky ones because you need extremely hard core consent at anonymity, right? You might have a young person who may consent to some sort of creative method, but then they may not fully understand to what extent they are consenting. So what I mean by that is we had an example where a young person consented to be recorded for a video about the key findings for a piece of research. They recorded the video, they were really happy with it, and then it dawned on them that actually that video is going to be played at a conference in front of 300 people. It was going to go on the website, and then they withdrew their consent. One, it's a really important example of that you can withdraw your consent at any time, even if the editor's done all the work and, pulling out 2 days is going to be a nightmare for the organization. It was important the organization didn't pressure them to do it. Big like it's already done now. Please don't do this, blah, blah, blah. They went, okay, you're not comfortable with it. We have to change it. But it's also the fact that I think that young person wasn't fully understanding where that would end up, right? So if you're doing a photo voice, where are those photos ending up? Who are they going to be shown to? I think getting them to envision the worst case scenario, which is always say, are you happy with this being on TikTok, right? Because they're all on TikTok. And the idea of if it would mortify them to see it on TikTok, then actually you have less constraint, right? You can't take young people's consent for creative input only because they think it's not going to be seen anywhere that they exist, right? If that makes sense, right? If they think their friends are going to see it, then they wouldn't consent anymore. That's not full consent. It has to be full consent, regardless of who sees it, because we're going to put it up, right? And we don't have control over it once it's in a public space. If that makes sense. Right, safeguarding. This I'm going to be quite short on because I think you sector understand this pretty well, right? We understand it's everyone's responsibility, just because they're peer researchers. I think it's about getting them involved in the safeguarding process because we cannot do it for them. So making sure that they're involved in understanding it's their responsibility as well, having a kind of background context about what that legal framework is and statutory guidance. Not going into too much detail, we kind of speak mostly in broad abstract, but it's kind of a safety first thing. So we talk about their role and the organization's role. So the organization's role is pretty standard, right? We make sure that they know who the safeguarding lead is, they know who to contact, we act on their concerns raised, and then we create safe spaces. For the peer researcher's role, it's very much like how do you recognize what a disclosure is, making sure that they understand that they are the eyes and the ears on the ground, they're the first point of contact. Not every peer researcher project will have a staff member sitting in with the interviews. I think it's a recommended thing, especially if you are dealing again with one of those sensitive issues or vulnerable communities. I think it's good to not have a peer researcher do these bits of field work alone in case there is a disclosure. But generally for those that don't, then it's really, really important that young people listen, they notice it, and then they feel comfortable passing it on immediately. They also have to know what their boundaries are, right? We always say it's everyone's responsibility. And I think for some young people who have a little bit more extroversion about them, they think it's their responsibility to find out what's going on as well. So they might investigate or they ask more questions or, they want to immediately start giving advice. So it's not just saying it's your responsibility to listen, pass the notice on, but it's also your responsibility not to push those boundaries, right? To understand what your professional responsibility is and how doing things that you might think are helpful might cause more harm, right? There was a good example from NACRO peer research, did it on youth justice. And again, very simple. Each peer researcher was paired with a staff member and they were available by phone throughout every day, and that's when you're doing it remotely, but also having a staff member on the day as well, asking them if it was fine, if anything came up, if there was anything they were worried about, specifically asking that, I think is really useful. Safeguarding in a research context can be a bit more tricky as well, right? So we talked about the power relationship between researchers and participants, especially if there's age imbalances, one of them's holding a recorder in their mouth. We talk about trying to make it a little bit more even by having a bit of preamble, making a bit more casual conversation. Next one's around exploring sensitive and emotive issues, which we've slightly talked about. Researchers working alone in the field, that's almost like the street example. Make sure that they're not alone. or doing it in dark or, whatever it is. Professional boundaries as well, which is similar to the power relationships. But I think it's not just about the power relationship. It's also making sure that we don't overshare too much about ourselves. You can do it if it builds rapport to a certain extent, but you are still a professional researcher in that sense. You are there to hear their voice, their opinion, and not dominate the conversation. And maybe overshare and make them feel uncomfortable. And then lastly, disclosures. So division of responsibility. Responsibility is just listen. We always say without judgment. We always err on the side of caution, so we very much drill it into peer researchers to stop interviews if they or them are feeling uncomfortable, right? We always just say hard stop on it. Don't try and continue. Don't be like, hey, let's break for 5 minutes. Just stop the interview. Always remember exactly what that disclosure was. Don't try and like paraphrase. All that basic stuff. We've never promised to keep a secret, pass on any concern, look after your own well-being. But I think for the staff, it's also stepping in if you manage or see any distress and all of the other stuff that we'd expect, log concerns, contact external, hold that legal duty, and then provide that structured debrief. We also, the most important thing that we teach is about disclosures, right? And how do you identify disclosures? There's kind of two types, that direct disclosure and that indiscreet, indirect disclosure. So the stuff where young people are directly sharing something with you that's very clear and implicit. And then it's the other stuff where it's almost like a puzzle piece where like a couple of things are flagged or there's a few things said and it's not direct, but you are concerned about it. And again, it's the really clear thing of if there's anything that worries you or if you feel unsure about, just speak to someone about it, right? Just make sure that you feel comfortable about it, and it's not your job to investigate it or solve it, right? And also having a go at getting them to practice this as well, because it can be quite tricky. Like, what do you do if something was disclosed, right? Do you tell those peer researchers to be like, that was a disclosure, I have to end the interview and then get up, right? It's really awkward. So actually it's practicing those social skills of like, how do you navigate those conversations if you pick something up? How do you flag it to the person you're speaking to without like alarming them that you're going to like run off and tell someone like immediately? So the first one's traffic light scenarios, as always, right? Like giving a range of scenarios and getting them to go green, which is no disclosure, everything's fine, not fine, but it's stuff that can be kept within the confines of the interview. There's the amber stuff, which if you're not sure or it raises a flag, you go off and tell a staff member. And there's red, like the full disclosure, you need to tell somebody. And again, all of this stuff is also not just about getting them to recognize disclosures, but also thinking about what they would do in that situation. So in particular, if a young person says to them, I want to tell you something, but you have to promise not to tell anyone, getting them to recognize that they can't do that is their responsibility to not keep it a secret as part of safeguarding. But then also getting them to go around and practice. Okay, how would they respond to that? Right. The thing that we always teach them is almost like the elevator pitch, right? Where the elevator pitch always includes the word harm to you or somebody else, right? Like I want to hear what you have to say, but I can't promise not to tell anyone, especially if I'm worried that the thing you tell me is gonna indicate that there's gonna be harm to you or someone else, right? Getting them to be able to say that confidently in a range of scenarios is the most important thing. And then we always teach them what to do during disclosure, right? And it's that basic thing of stay calm, acknowledge what they've said, record exactly what was said. If they have a piece of paper, not an interpretation, you listen to them, you don't probe or investigate. You tell them those honest next steps, and that's a really good thing to practice. Look, I'm going to have to pass it on to Matt because he's our safeguarding lead, and it's just because I was a little bit worried about this. And then you report it immediately. Don't wait to the end of the day. But again, you probably will have the debrief after each interview. So just do it as soon as the interview's done. And then lastly, disclosure role play. So it's a really nice game to get them to play, where one is the peer researcher, one is the participant. And the participant has a scenario card where they read gradually something that increases in concern. And they're structured. Those cards are very different ways. Some of them are kind of green, 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 sudden red, green, green. Some of them are a little bit more like green, orange, green, orange, green, orange, and it builds up to a level of concern. And then also it's just fun, right? Because you get the young people to like act in certain ways and think about how a young person, if they were feeling these things, would disclose it, right? They would just come out and blurt it, the way that they'd go around it as well. And And it does create like a serious game in some respects because you see the people playing, the participants, they almost don't want to be caught, right? It's almost like it turns into a gamified thing where they don't want to be called out. They don't want the person they're working with to know whether it was a disclosure or not that they've got on their card. So they are far more subtle about it as well, which is great because it means that the researchers really have to listen to what's being said and really spot the things that would be worrying. Um, and yeah, gets them to respond in the moment, gets them to think about what questions to ask, and then how to kind of tell someone. So, last section, no, data protection GDPR, that we're going to talk about consent. So, in terms of data protection GDPR, just some kind of good guidance. We're not going to go through all of the GDPR law because nobody deserves that on a Tuesday morning. But it's kind of just about how we collect it, store it, use it, delete that information. You have your own GDPR practices. Um, but generally, what we say is if you're not comfortable showing this data to the participant themselves, you know, something's kind of gone wrong. And by that, I mean you're making sure that you're keeping all of their data safe, you're not breaching their privacy, you're not exposing the organization to legal action, which is an important one, but also destroying trust. So we really think collecting information about real young people, right? That information does belong to them, not us, and we have a responsibility to make sure that it's incredibly safe, right? And one of the games that we play is we got, and I stole this from Dr. Luke and Mike Bradley from Hertfordshire, because I think it's a great one, to get all the young people to have a piece of paper and they write down one of their deepest, darkest secrets that they don't want anyone to know about. And then they fold it in half, and then they have to move that paper around to the person next to you, right? And no one reads it, but it's about getting them to reflect on how do they feel that that secret is in someone's hands opposite them who could read it, right? It's getting them to understand the value that that data has, the importance privacy plays, and how it would make them feel if that was violated, right? And that kind of frames GDPR as less a legal duty, but more that responsibility that they have. We talk about the kind of general key principles. We don't always go into too much detail about it because not all of these things are necessarily important for young people. They are extremely important for you as an organization to make sure that you have a GDPR statement. We have a data protection sheet sometimes where it's like all the tick boxes of stuff that we need to do to make sure that we're meeting these principles. But yeah, you will have your own processes there. The thing I really want to focus in on is how you're doing it with young people. So uh, it's also storing data. I think that's the most important thing. So there's some stuff around like password protected folders, organizational clouds, log on, and how you do all those things. I think with peer research, this is where it gets particularly challenging. I think organizations are pretty good at doing this themselves, but the do not start to creep in when peer researchers are involved because they will have their own Google Drives, they'll have their own phones, they'll have WhatsApp, you'll have WhatsApp groups. And it's how do you manage that, right? Especially if they're doing interviews. We have now got external recording devices which are dumb. And by that, I'm not insulting intelligence. It means they're not connected to the internet, right? So it's just like an old school recorder. Those are what should be provided. They're password protected. It gets brought in by the organization straight away. The challenge is when young people record interviews on their mobile phones, right? Because you cannot verify that that's being deleted. It is not a secure device. They might share it in the WhatsApp group. You can tell them to take it off the WhatsApp group, but you don't know who's downloaded it from the WhatsApp by the time you've taken it down. And ultimately, I don't think peer researchers are necessarily the most interested in collecting audio recordings of strangers on their phones, right? I don't think the incentive is there, but it doesn't matter, right? Legally, for GDPR purposes, you have to make sure they don't do those things. So all of those logistics of how they're carrying out that field work and how they're going to share it back with you as an organization is kind of the main risk, right? So you do that kind of data audit with them, right? If you're doing surveys or interviews or whatever it is, you think about it, right? Who's the named data controller, right? And that's usually a staff member, but you can designate some responsibility to one of the young people, peer researchers as well. Do you have dedicated recording devices? How are you going to do it? When are you going to delete them? What are the consent forms and are they GDPR compliant? Where is it going to be stored and is that secure? It's taking young people through that process as well, right? Even if they are not responsible for a lot of those steps, It's about this is the steps that we're taking as an organization. Your role in this might be just this bit where you have the dedicated recording device, you don't share it with anyone, you give it back to us. But here's all the subsequent steps that we're taking, right? Because this is how we do it, and this is important, right? It's a good reflective practice to make sure that you're doing it, but it's also making sure that young people understand it so there is no slippage, right? Because, oh, I forgot my recording device, but don't worry, I put it on my phone. Those kind of things can happen. Consent, and this is the last section. And this is one of the most important sections. It's one of the most challenging because there's so many different ways of doing it. I think every organization has a different consent form, um, but it's one of the most important ones to do with young people. So when we talk about good consent, it has to be informed, and we'll talk about an information sheet in a little bit, making sure you have an information sheet. They really understand what not just they're agreeing to, but what the whole study is. Like, what's the research about? Why are you doing it? Where's it come from? Free. So we say free, but it's voluntary, right? It has to be, no peer pressure, genuine option. If you're remunerating them or remunerating participants, it's an understanding of why you're doing it, and their remuneration is, a thank you for it. It's not kind of why they're necessarily doing it. It has to be super specific as well to what you're doing. So if you're doing photo voice, you need photo voice stuff in there. If you're doing stuff around interviews, then it needs to be audio recordings, right? You don't need more than you need, right? You don't need to talk about consent for interviews if you're not doing them, but it has to be really tailored to the activities you're doing with them. Ongoing as well, it's not just a sign off, right? And by that, we mean they need to have contact details of you. They need to be able to get in contact in 3 weeks' time and say that they want to withdraw. They have to be aware of the timelines of when this project's taking place, because then they can withdraw. But then you go, well, actually, but the report's going to be published end of April. So post that, we can't really withdraw your consent into it, but up to that point, whatever, right? Making sure they understand. Um, yeah, up to the point the data is anonymized and published is really important. So what's good consent? So we talk about information sheets. So information sheets are the first thing that you really need. It's like, it tells them what the project's about, how the information is being used, the safety exceptions around safeguarding, what we're taking part involved. We're going to talk for 30 minutes, how your identity will be protected. How do we do that in the transcripts or whatever it is, and their rights. These things are really, really important. This is the biggest opportunity in terms of peer researchers and their co-production of what you'll generally find with the information sheets, especially if they come from a university or whatever it is. They will be like 8 pages long, and no teenager is ever going to necessarily read it, right? Unless you force them for half an hour to sit down and read it. So it's about how do you do this work with young people? How do you get a really detailed information sheet and get young people to co-produce it, write it in their own ways, make a visualization of it, put it through Canva, whatever it is. It doesn't make it less valid as a good information sheet. What it's doing is it's making it a stronger information sheet because it's more reliably read and understood and accessible as a result of the young people translating it, right? So, and also if the young people design the information sheet, that's really good because they're the ones who have to deliver it as well. They will have to give it to the young people, talk them through it, make sure that they've understood it as well. So if they have a clear understanding of what the wording is, then that makes it way easier. So the second one is designing a consent form, right? And I'll talk about kind of example consent forms, but we give them a range of consent forms. We give them our consent form, our university one, another one from the youth sector organization. We get them to read it and then just highlight the words that they find confusing, right? This isn't just about co-designing and co-producing consent form, but it's also just about understanding maybe some of the language and how we translate it as well. So how do you rewrite it? If you read it aloud, how would you sign it? Do you think it captures all of the considerations that a young person might have with it? And then also, here's the tick boxes, right? Here's all the list of things that they might want to agree to. Which ones do we need, right? Almost like a pick and choose, build your own adventure consent form, right? Do we need to say, I agree to be audio recorded? No, because we're not going to record them. Fine, that doesn't need to be needed, right? So kind of here's all the building blocks of a consent form. Here's all the complicated language. How do we translate it? What building blocks do you need for your research and for your consent form, right? And then the next bit is once they have that consent form, and this is more important than consent form, right? Because the consent form could be like absolutely bulletproof and the best consent form in the entire world. But if you don't have the researchers understanding their script and how you explain it and how do you talk through it, it doesn't matter, right? Because you might be in the same situation where young people just tick, 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 they sign, they don't read it, and they just give it over and that's done, right? The more important thing about informed consent is upskilling those peer researchers to actually spend dedicated time before the interview begins to explain the project, explain the information sheet, and to explain the consent form about what they're doing. So we always do kind of 3 point explanations. The first one is kind of be impact focused, why they're doing it, right? It's not just we're doing some research to find out X. It's we are a group of young people from here or this organization. We're finding out about this topic so we can have this impact, right? Then it's the information sheet stuff, right? Like we'd like to ask you questions about this. It'll take this amount of time. You don't have to answer. And then the third one is more about the consent stuff. So we're not going to use your real name. Everything's going to be anonymous. By that, we mean we're going to do this to make sure that it's not involved. If you say your street name, if you say a friend's name, don't worry, that's all going to be anonymized as well. You can, withdraw at any time. Here's my email, or here's the email of the staff member. Just email them anytime up to now, and then we can get rid of it, right? Making sure that they have that script, and we get them into pairs to practice it as well. So we give them those consent forms and they have to fully understand it and just practice their kind of scripts of how you do this, right? So ongoing consent right to withdraw. So we do the consent before the session, right? So as a group or with the youth workers, making sure that all the participants have signed the information sheet. We do it at the start as well. So the young people, when they sit down, even before they record, they make sure that they've got the consent, done it, blah, 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 give them the whole rights again. I think it's also important to teach young people to do it during the interview as well, especially if there's difficult topics or they can sense hesitation. It's not a safeguarding disclosure level. It's more just about if you don't feel they feel comfortable talking about it, then that's a consent issue. So are you okay to continue? If the topics have changed as well, you might want to reconfirm consent. So, for example, if you have a whole range of topics about housing, you've told them it's a piece of research about housing, but they start to talk about mental health as a barrier, making sure you go, look, we've started to talk about mental health as a barrier. Are you still comfortable to talk about that, right? Because that's not necessarily what they consented for at the beginning, because you told them it's a big piece of research about housing, and now your peer researcher wants to talk about mental health, right? It's a shift that they might not have consented for. Right to withdraw, making sure that they have contact information, can get in contact really quickly to withdraw, but also being honest about the limits, right? It's going to be published then, it's going to be anonymized then. We only have up to now. And then after the session as well. And this is the bit that I think lots of organizations don't do. How do you contact participants afterwards to tell them what happens next? And also, how do you get the research back to them as well? Last two things, I'm not going to talk it through. We'll send this round. It's really useful. It's just information sheet, examples and links, the stuff that you should include, the stuff that you should avoid, like legalese, vague promises, unconditional confidentiality. And there's a couple of examples, one from University of Leeds, Bournemouth University, University of Cambridge, and the Health Research Authority, right, depending on what piece of research you're doing. I would always do a information sheet designed with young people, make it incredibly visual, even make it a digital resource. Doesn't necessarily need to be paper and pen as well. QR codes, they can scan it, they can read it, whatever it is. But it's all the important stuff about everything they need to know. But also the thing is, it's the so what, like why should they be involved in it as well? It's that action impact side of it, right? As not just the ethics and consent. And then ongoing consent as well. I've given a whole list of different examples there. And again, you'll see this for yourself. They are all very, very different. Barnardo's is different to NSPCC's. Universities are very different. University of Cambridge has got some really good consent form guidance and examples. All of it's going to be a sense of compromise, though, right? You will have to compromise about how long that consent is, how thorough it is. We generally as guidance say it should only be 1 page because young people will read 1 page. And I think any more than that, and you're in danger of them not fully engaging with it. But loads of consent forms are like 3 pages long, right? They can be really, really complicated and they can be really, really long. So again, it's that thing of building blocks, have a look at it and think about what works best for you. And the last thing I would say is, in particular, for you participants under 16, you need both carer consent and young people's consent forms. So it's really difficult to do research with under 16s. You will need to get them and their parents to consent to it as well. There are other ways of doing it. You can do an opt-out consent. but I would double check with that. Like you email all the parents telling them the research is happening and to get in contact with you if they're not happy for their young person to be involved. But it gets a bit tricky, and then you would actually need to take proper legal advice on it. But yeah, parental consent's really important for under 16s. But you don't just get the parental consent, you need the parental consent and that young person's consent as well. So key takeaways, last thing I'll say. So ethics is less of a clear set of rules, and it's more about teaching young people to behave in ethical ways. It's about behaviors, it's about power dynamics, it's about fairness, and it's thinking about reducing harm, right? It's a way of getting them to act responsibly and professionally rather than rules to follow. It's not here are the ethical things that you need to do. It's how do you act ethically as a researcher? And I think power is the most important part of that, right? Thinking about the balances. And I think sometimes we talk about peers as peers and you're all peers and therefore everything's equal. But, gender dynamics, age dynamics, having a clipboard or a recording device, asking the questions, all of those things come into play very, very quickly, especially in a one-to-one interview. So getting them to recognize that, understand it, and then work to balance it. Next one is safeguarding. It's mostly the organization's responsibility, but how do you kind of upskill young people and understand that it is their responsibility and how to identify disclosures? The limits on confidentiality and anonymity as well. Data protection, how do you do that with young people and how do you make sure that you collect only what you need and then store it safely? And then the last thing, which I've said multiple times, but again, bears worth repeating, it's an ongoing process. It's a continual process. It's a conversational process. It isn't just about the consent form, right? It goes throughout the entire research process. And any consent has to think about what the long-term goals of the research is that for the young people consenting. Great. So